Something is happening in the water. It looks almost tender at first.
You might assume it's play. You might assume it's grooming, but not this. The animal doing the holding is an otter, and it isn't playing.
The scientists watching through the lens have seen a lot of things in their careers, but not this. The animal doing the holding is an otter, and it isn't playing. We have a problem with cute animals, not with the animals themselves, with what we do to them inside our heads. We look at a sea otter floating on its back, paws folded against its chest, and something in us softens immediately. We share the videos, we name them, we put them in children's books. We build an entire emotional narrative around a creature we've never met, based almost entirely on the shape of its face and the way it drifts through the water like it has nowhere to be. But the otter doesn't know it's cute, and it certainly doesn't behave that way. What researchers have documented about otter behavior over the past 2 decades doesn't fit the story we've been telling. It doesn't fit the plush toys, or the Instagram reels, or the wildlife sanctuary fundraising campaigns. And I think that's exactly why it matters. Because the gap between what we believe about an animal and what that animal actually does tells us something far more interesting about the animal, and something far more uncomfortable about ourselves. Hold that thought. Sea otters, Enhydra lutris, are genuinely remarkable animals. Let's be clear about that before we go anywhere else. They're one of the few non-primate mammals known to use tools, cracking shellfish against rocks balanced on their chests. They play a critical ecological role as keystone predators in kelp forest ecosystems, keeping sea urchin populations in check and allowing entire underwater forests to survive. They nearly went extinct in the 18th and 19th centuries due to the fur trade, and their recovery along the California coast is one of conservation biology's genuine success stories. All of that is real. All of that matters. But here's what the conservation campaigns tend to leave out. Sea otters are also one of the few non-human mammals for which researchers have documented repeated coercive sexual behavior, including behavior directed at members of entirely different species. And unlike most dark corners of the animal kingdom, this one has been filmed, measured, and published in peer-reviewed journals. The team from the Marine Mammal Center had been on the water for weeks. Field work like theirs is mostly routine. Position the vessel, track the animals, log the behavior, move on. That morning, off Moss Landing, California, one of the researchers spotted a male otter with what appeared to be a juvenile harbor seal pup. Nothing alarming at first. Otters and harbor seals share habitat along the California coast. Brief interactions aren't unusual, but the male didn't move on. Minutes passed. The researchers watched. They consulted their field protocols. They checked their cameras. The event they were witnessing had no clean category in their notes. It didn't match foraging behavior. It didn't match play. And it didn't match any agonistic pattern they'd logged before. By the time they fully understood what they were observing, enough time had passed that the team said almost nothing to each other. What they documented that morning, and in multiple subsequent observations, was coercive sexual behavior between a male sea otter and a juvenile harbor seal. Marine biologist Heather Harris and her colleagues eventually published their findings in the journal Aquatic Mammals, describing a recurring behavioral pattern across multiple individuals. The pup from that first observation did not survive the encounter. What struck Harris in her analysis wasn't just the behavior itself, it was that the males involved weren't random outliers. They were young adults, sexually mature but socially marginalized, animals on the edge of their own hierarchy. And that detail, she noted, was the key to understanding everything. If this already challenges something you assumed, good. That discomfort is worth sitting with. And if you're finding this genuinely fascinating, The like button is right there. It's the fastest way to tell the algorithm this kind of content is worth spreading. Here's the part that most wildlife documentaries skip entirely. Not because the answer is complicated, but because it's uncomfortable. To understand what's actually happening, you need to understand the reproductive pressures facing male sea otters and what natural selection does to animals operating under extreme competition. Male sea otters don't form stable pair bonds. Reproduction is competitive, and access to females is not evenly distributed. Dominant males hold territories in prime habitat and father most of the offspring. Younger males, or those lower in the hierarchy, are often excluded from mating opportunities for extended periods. This is a pattern that appears across dozens of mammalian species. It's not unique to otters. And the behavioral consequences have been documented in everything, from dolphins to elephant seals to certain primate populations. What evolution produces under these conditions is not necessarily what we'd call morally coherent behavior. It produces behavior that propagates genes. Full stop. Harris was careful to note that the behavior, while disturbing from a human perspective, fits within known frameworks of what happens when male mammals with high reproductive drive have limited access to females. The brain doesn't distinguish between species in the same way we do culturally. The triggers for sexual behavior in many mammals are surprisingly broad and occasionally catastrophically misdirected. I find this genuinely difficult to sit with, not because it's shocking in a cheap way, but because it forces a question most wildlife content refuses to ask. What do we actually owe animals? Accurate understanding or comfortable mythology? Researchers at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who study otter population dynamics, have noted something important. The males most likely to engage in this behavior are often the ones in the worst ecological shape. Marginalized, calorie-stressed, excluded from social structures that would otherwise regulate their behavior. The violence, in other words, isn't random. It's a pressure valve, and the pressure comes from a combination of biology, hierarchy, and habitat stress. This is where it stops being just about otters. Biologist and author Hale Herzog, in his work on human-animal relationships, argues that we are systematically irrational about the animals we choose to love. We project onto them, we flatten them. We select the footage that confirms our emotional narrative and quietly bury the rest. Herzog calls this the cute response, a hardwired neurological reaction to certain facial features that bypasses our critical thinking almost entirely. Baby-like features, large eyes, round heads, small noses, trigger the same caregiving circuits in the human brain that evolved for infant recognition. It doesn't matter if the creature triggering them is a human baby, a teddy bear, or a sea otter. The brain fires the same way, and once that circuit is activated, we become remarkably resistant to information that contradicts the emotional conclusion we've already reached. That's why the otter videos go viral. That's why the research papers don't. Think about what that means for a second, not just for otters, but for how we relate to the natural world at large. We have built an entire cultural relationship with wildlife. On the foundation of our own neurological biases, we protect the animals we find cute. We fund research into the species that photograph well. We build sanctuaries for the ones whose faces fit our emotional templates. And we quietly ignore the complexity, the violence, the coercion, the brutal efficiency of natural selection that doesn't fit the story. The sea otter is, in this sense, a perfect case study. Because there is almost no animal that has benefited more from human affection, and almost no animal whose actual behavior diverges more sharply from the affection we project onto it. And here's what I keep coming back to. The real otter, the one doing complex things, terrible things sometimes, survival things, is far more interesting than the cute one. The real otter exists inside an ecosystem of pressures so intricate and so demanding that the behaviors we find disturbing are, in their own way, evidence of something remarkable, not virtue, not cruelty, something more honest than either, pure biological imperatives, playing out without apology. The research team at Moss Landing eventually stopped documenting the specific interactions that had drawn so much attention, partly because continued observation risked habituating the animals to human presence, and partly, one suspects, because the footage was doing something uncomfortable to the public narrative around otter conservation. The otters, for their part, continued doing what otters do. The population along the California coast has grown steadily in the decades since near extinction. The kelp forests they protect have recovered in many areas. Their ecological role is real and significant, and the conservation work built around them has genuine value. None of that changes, but neither does the footage from Moss Landing, and neither do the 12 documented interspecies coercive events that Heather Harris and her colleagues logged before the data was published, and the scientific community quietly absorbed it. Neither does the growing body of research suggesting that behavioral complexity in mammals, including complexity we find deeply uncomfortable, is not an exception to the natural order, it is the natural order. What we call brutal, the natural world calls pressure. What we call aberrant, evolutionary biology calls a response to resource stress. What we call innocence, that round-faced, paw-tucking, floating on its back innocence we project onto sea otters, is something we invented. The animal never agreed to it. I think that's the more interesting story, not that otters are monsters, they aren't, but that the distance between what we imagine animals to be and what they actually are is a mirror, and what it reflects isn't the animal, it reflects us. Nature is far more brilliant than we imagine. See you on our next exploration. And if this is the kind of thinking you want more of, if you want a channel that refuses to flatten the natural world into something comfortable, subscribe. Every week, we go deeper.